Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, there are working towns and mountain communities that barely show up on the map, places where the fog rolls in off the water. The mills shut down years ago, and people drift through with pockets full of cash and no one waiting for them at home. They look quiet. But if you stay long enough, you find out what the locals never put in the brochures. Tonight's stories all come from those forgotten corners. A weather-beaten Union Hall hanging over a Washington harbor, where a trusted rep used a hidden trapdoor to turn transient workers into ghosts. A cozy mountain town bar where an invisible narcissist hunted successful women and staged their bodies like art in the dark. And a converted warehouse outside a small Oregon town where a young mail-order bride thought she'd found freedom, until her husband decided she was a defective product to be buried deep in the Cascades. Before the stories start, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you'd still take a job in an isolated coastal town or move to a quiet PNW community after hearing these. Also, YouTube tells me that only about 4% of the people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you're in that other 96%, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, it helps more than you think, and it keeps this channel digging up the stories that never should have been buried. Now turn down the lights, and let's head into the trees. Story 1. This happened back in October of 2001, and I still think about it pretty much every day. I'm talking about the kind of thing that changes you, the kind of experience that makes you realize how close you came to just vanishing off the face of the earth without a trace. I was 26 years old at the time, working on commercial fishing boats up and down the Oregon and Washington coast. It wasn't glamorous work, far from it. But it paid cash under the table, and I needed cash badly. I'd left Montana about 6 months earlier after my girlfriend kicked me out, and I'd blown through what little savings I had within the first month. The fishing industry seemed like a good way to reset my life, make some quick money, keep my head down, and figure out my next move without anyone asking too many questions. By late October, I'd been working out of a small town called Crestfall Bay on the Washington coast. If you've never heard of it, that's not surprising at all. It's one of those industrial fishing towns tucked away on the Pacific coastline, all gray-weathered buildings, constant smell of diesel fuel and fish guts, and a population that mostly keeps to itself. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, but nobody talks about it directly. You could disappear into a town like that, and nobody would ask questions. That's exactly why I was there, and exactly why it was so dangerous. I'd been working on a fishing boat called the Salish Pride for about 3 weeks straight, pulling 14-hour shifts in freezing rain and sleeping in a cramped bunkhouse near the docks that smelled like mildew and cigarettes. The captain was a guy named Lyle Brenneman, decent enough in that rough fisherman way, but he worked us like dogs. No complaints, though. By the end of that 3-week run, I'd earned just over $6,000 in cash, which was more money than I'd seen in years. For a drifter like me, that was life-changing money. It meant I could actually get ahead instead of just treading water. The way it worked in Crestfall Bay was pretty standard for fishing towns. The union rep held on to workers' earnings for safekeeping in his office safe. Most of us were drifters with no permanent addresses, no bank accounts, and no legitimate identification. Carrying $6,000 in cash around the docks was asking to get robbed, jumped in an alley, or worse. The union was supposed to protect us. That was the whole point. The union rep's name was Vernon Keller, and he ran the local maritime workers' union office right on Pier 9 overlooking the harbor. Everyone I talked to said Vernon was a solid guy, been doing the job for 15 years or more, helped workers with pay disputes, fought for better conditions, and kept their money safe until they were ready to move on. He had a reputation as one of the good ones. I'd met Vernon briefly when I first arrived in Crestfall Bay back in September. He'd processed my paperwork, such as it was, and set up my account with the union. He seemed fine at first glance. He was an older guy, maybe in his early 50s, with a thick gray beard and these pale blue eyes that didn't really blink much. His handshake was firm, and his voice was gravelly, like he'd spent years smoking cheap cigarettes. There was something about him that felt slightly off, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way he looked at you, like he was measuring you, calculating your worth. Or maybe it was just me being paranoid after months of living on the margins. I dismissed the feeling and figured he was just another weathered fisherman type who'd seen too much. On October 23rd, I decided it was time to collect my money and move on from Crestfall Bay. The weather was getting worse, storms rolling in off the Pacific every other day, and I'd heard through the grapevine that there wasn't much work coming up for November. The season was ending and guys were starting to leave. I figured I'd head down to Portland or maybe even back east to try to find something steadier for the winter. Maybe finally get my life together. I went to the union office around 7:30 in the evening. I remember checking my watch because I wanted to make sure Vernon would still be there. It was already getting dark outside, and most of the boats were tied up for the night, their masts creaking in the wind. The union office was this old two-story building that sat right at the end of Pier 9, built directly over the water. You could hear the waves slapping hard against the wooden pilings underneath, and the whole structure seemed to sway slightly when the wind picked up. It gave me an uneasy feeling every time I walked in there. The first floor was just a common area with some beaten-up couches that smelled like salt and old beer, a couple of vending machines that never worked, and a bulletin board covered in faded safety notices and job postings that were months out of date. There was a small bathroom in the corner that I wouldn't use unless it was an absolute emergency. The place felt abandoned even when people were in it. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the second floor where Vernon's office was located. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I could smell seawater and old wood. That specific damp rot smell that gets into buildings near the ocean. Vernon's door was half open, and I could see him sitting behind his big oak desk, doing paperwork under a dim desk lamp. The overhead lights were off, so the room was mostly shadows. He looked up when I knocked on the doorframe, and his face shifted into what I think was supposed to be a smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. He waved me in with one hand and told me to have a seat, his voice friendly enough, but somehow flat. The office was more cramped than I remembered. It smelled like old wood and seawater and something else I couldn't identify, something slightly metallic. There was Vernon's heavy oak desk positioned in the center of the room, filing cabinets pushed up against the walls on both sides, creating a narrow path to the door, and a single window behind Vernon's desk with thick, dark curtains that blocked most of the view of the harbor outside. I could hear foghorns in the distance and the constant hum of a generator from the fish processing plant next door. The chair Vernon gestured to was this oversized wooden thing with arms, positioned right in the center of the room directly across from his desk. It felt oddly staged, like furniture arranged for a specific purpose rather than comfort or function. But I sat down anyway. What else was I going to do? Vernon asked me how the work had been on the Salish Pride, and I told him it was fine, that Captain Brenneman ran a tight ship. He nodded and pulled out his ledger, flipping through pages slowly, while commenting on the weather and how the fishing season was winding down earlier than usual this year. He seemed completely relaxed, almost too relaxed for someone handling thousands of dollars in cash. He asked if I wanted a drink, said he had some decent whiskey, and I declined. I wanted to keep my head clear. He shrugged and poured himself something from a bottle in his desk drawer, taking a slow sip while watching me over the rim of the glass. Those pale blue eyes just staring. Then he started asking me questions. Where was I headed next? Did I have family waiting for me somewhere? Was anyone expecting me to call or check in? At first I thought he was just making standard small talk, the kind of conversation you have when you're stuck in a room with someone for a few minutes. But the more he asked, the more pointed the questions felt. There was a purpose behind them. I told him I was probably going to head down to Portland, maybe look for construction work or something indoors for the winter. I mentioned that I didn't really have family to speak of, which was true, and that nobody was expecting me, anywhere in particular. I remember him nodding slowly when I said that, like he was filing the information away somewhere in his head, like it confirmed something he'd already suspected. He finished his drink and set the glass down carefully on the desk. Then he leaned back in his chair and opened the safe behind him. It was one of those old combination safes built into the wall, and I heard the heavy metal door swing open with a low creak. He pulled out a metal cash box. My cash box. The one with my fake name written on a piece of tape on the lid. He set it on the desk between us and opened it with a small key kept on a chain around his neck. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, 50s and 20s, my money, my 3 weeks of brutal labor in the freezing rain. Vernon started counting it out in front of me, making neat stacks on the desk. 60 $100 bills, 40 50s, a stack of 20s for the remainder. He counted slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring the moment. I felt a rush of relief seeing that money right there in front of me. It represented more than just cash. It represented freedom, possibility, a chance to start over somewhere new. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, my eyes fixed on the stacks of bills. Vernon pushed them toward me across the desk, and I reached out to take them. That's when I noticed his other hand, his left hand. It was resting inside an open drawer on his side of the desk, hidden from my view. But I could see his arm position and the way his fingers were wrapped around something. A lever or a handle, maybe. I couldn't see it clearly, but the grip looked deliberate, purposeful. His knuckles were white from how hard he was holding whatever it was. I froze. My hand was stretched out toward the money, but I didn't complete the motion. Something in my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. You know that feeling? That primal instinct that kicks in when you're in danger, even if you can't consciously identify the threat? It's like your body knows before your brain catches up. Every muscle in my body tensed. I pulled my hand back slowly and glanced down at the floor beneath my chair for the first time since I'd sat down. The seams didn't match. The floorboards beneath my chair were different from the rest of the room. They were newer, cleaner, and the seams formed a rectangular outline, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet. The wood grain didn't align with the surrounding floor. And the chair itself was positioned with surgical precision right in the center of that rectangle. Not off to the side, not angled, dead center. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked back up at Vernon, and his expression had changed completely. The fake friendliness was gone. His face was cold and emotionless. Those pale blue eyes were locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His left hand tightened its grip on whatever was in that drawer. I could see his forearm muscles flex. He was getting ready to pull it. Whatever it was, he was about to pull it. I didn't wait to find out what would happen. I grabbed the cash off the desk in one motion, didn't bother to stack it or organize it, just snatched all of it, and stood up fast. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Vernon stood too, but he didn't come around the desk toward me. He just stood there watching me, with that same cold, calculating expression. Like he was measuring something, deciding something. His hand was still in that drawer. I took one step toward the door, and that's when I heard it. A faint mechanical click followed by a low creak. The sound of metal moving. The sound of something unlocking. I didn't turn around to look. I didn't wait to see what it was. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I shoved past the filing cabinet that partially blocked the door, nearly knocking it over. I heard Vernon say something behind me. I couldn't make out the words over. The sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears, but his tone was sharp, angry, like I'd ruined something. I hit the stairs and took them 3 at a time, nearly falling twice. My boots slammed against the wood, and I heard the whole staircase groan under my weight. I burst through the ground floor common area and out into the night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran down Pier 9 toward the main dock area, my lungs burning and my legs pumping. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. I didn't stop running until I was 3 full blocks away from the Union Hall, gasping for air in the dark parking lot of a closed bait shop. I bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the cash that I'd stuffed into my jacket pockets. My heart was hammering, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had Vernon looked at me like that? What was that lever in his desk drawer? What was that clicking sound? And why the hell was that floor different beneath that chair? I stood there in the dark for maybe 10 minutes, trying to calm down and think rationally. Part of me wondered if I'd overreacted. Maybe Vernon was just reaching for something innocent in that drawer. Maybe the floor was just old and had been repaired at some point. Maybe I'd let my paranoia get the better of me. But another part of me, the part that had kept me alive on the streets and on the road, knew better. That part knew I'd just barely escaped something terrible. I should have gone to the police right then. That's what a smart person would have done. That's what a normal person with a normal life would have done. But I wasn't normal. I was a drifter with $6,000 in cash and no permanent address. I didn't have identification that matched my real name. I'd been using a fake Social Security number to get work because I had some minor warrants back in Montana for unpaid tickets. Going to the cops felt like it would create more problems than it solved. They'd ask questions I couldn't answer. They'd want to know why I was working under a fake name. They'd probably take my money as evidence. And what would I even tell them? That a union rep had given me a bad feeling? That I thought maybe something was weird about his office floor? So I did what drifters do. I left. I walked back to the bunkhouse, grabbed my duffel bag with the few possessions I owned, and hitchhiked out of Crestfall Bay that same night. I caught a ride with a trucker, heading south, and I didn't look back. I spent that night in the cab of his truck, staring out the window at the dark Pacific coastline passing by, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. Trying to convince myself I'd just overreacted. For the next year and a half, I tried my best to forget about Crestfall Bay. I told myself I'd misread the situation, that I'd spooked myself over nothing. I worked construction jobs in Portland, then moved east to Boise for a while, then up to Spokane. I got my life somewhat together, got a real Social Security card, opened a bank account, found a decent apartment. I stopped drifting, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The memory of Vernon's hand on that lever. The memory of how that floor felt wrong beneath my feet. The memory of the look in his eyes when I stood up. That cold, predatory calculation. It haunted my dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, convinced I could hear that mechanical clicking sound. Then in the spring of 2003, about a year and a half after I'd left Crestfall Bay, I was sitting in a diner in Tacoma, eating a late breakfast, when I saw the newspaper someone had left on the counter. Front page story, big headline. Union official convicted of serial murder in Crestfall Bay. I felt my blood turn to ice. There was Vernon's face staring at me from the page. Vernon Keller, the union rep, the man whose office I'd run from. He looked older in the photo, more haggard, but it was definitely him. Those same pale blue eyes. I grabbed the newspaper with shaking hands and read the entire article, right there at the counter, my breakfast forgotten. Vernon Keller had been convicted of murdering 37 transient workers over an 8-year period. The article described in horrifying detail how he'd built a trapdoor mechanism into his office floor, a trapdoor that dropped unsuspecting victims 18 feet straight down into Crestfall Harbor. He would position them in a specific chair directly over the trapdoor, count out their cash to distract them, and then pull a lever hidden in his desk drawer. The floor would drop open on spring-loaded hinges, and the victim would fall through into the cold water below. Sometimes he'd shoot them with a small caliber pistol as they fell. Sometimes he'd just let them drown. The bodies would get swept out to sea by the strong tidal currents. Most were never recovered. I sat in that diner booth reading and rereading the article, my hands shaking just like they had that night in October. The chair I'd sat in was positioned directly over that trapdoor. Vernon's hand had been on the lever ready to pull it. I had been seconds, maybe 1 second, away from falling through that floor. Seconds away from dropping into freezing black water. Seconds away from becoming victim number 38. If I hadn't noticed his hand in that drawer, if I hadn't looked down at the floor, if I hadn't stood up exactly when I did, I would have died that night. Another unidentified body floating out into the Pacific Ocean. Another ghost. The article said Vernon had kept detailed records in a ledger. Names, dates, cash amounts stolen. 37 men listed with a little anchor symbol drawn next to each name in red ink. All of them were transients just like me. Drifters with no families or fake names or outstanding warrants. Men who wouldn't be immediately missed. Men who'd explicitly told others they were going off the grid or heading to the next town. Men like me. The article also mentioned that investigators believed there were potentially dozens more victims, maybe as many as 80 total, but they couldn't prove it because the bodies were too decomposed or were never recovered at all. Vernon had been killing since at least 1994 and possibly earlier. I found out from following the news coverage that Vernon had an accomplice, a guy named Andy Holcomb, who worked as night security at the Union Hall. Andy had helped Vernon clean up after the murders, dispose of evidence, and even temporarily store bodies in a walk-in freezer when the tidal timing wasn't right. Andy had lived with that guilt for years, drinking himself into oblivion every night, until he finally couldn't take it anymore. He'd gone to the police and confessed to everything. His testimony, his detailed first-hand accounts of 28 murders, is what brought Vernon down. Without Andy's confession, Vernon might have kept going indefinitely. He might still be there in that office, pulling that lever, dropping people into the harbor. Vernon was sentenced to 62 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. They convicted him on 62 murder counts total, even though they could only definitively identify 37 victims. The trial was apparently one of the biggest in Washington state history. But Vernon never showed remorse, never apologized. He told the court that his victims were already ghosts, and that he'd simply processed waste. He viewed the whole thing as a business operation. He'd murdered 37 people minimum and stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he felt nothing, absolutely nothing. But apparently, prison changed him. According to the news reports, Vernon completely lost his mind behind bars. Within a couple of years, he started hallucinating, claiming he could hear the victims coming back for him. He'd scream at night about drowning, about seeing wet footprints leading to his cell, about hands reaching for him from under his bunk. The guards said he'd covered his cell walls with tide charts drawn in his own blood. He refused to sleep, refused to shower because he said the water brought them closer. He became convinced the victims were drowning him slowly from beyond the grave. In 2009, Vernon Keller died in a psychiatric hospital where he'd been transferred. He drowned himself in 4 inches of water on his cell floor. He'd torn his sink off the wall, flooded the cell, and held his own face down in the shallow water until he asphyxiated. The guards found him at 3:17 in the morning, 3:17 a.m., which investigators later realized was the exact time of high tide at Crestfall Bay. Vernon had given himself the same death he'd given to his victims. Drowning, cold water, darkness. I think about Crestfall Bay more often than I probably should. I think about the 37 men who sat in that same chair and didn't stand up in time. Men who trusted Vernon. Men who had no idea they were sitting on a trapdoor positioned directly over cold black harbor water. I think about how close I came to joining them. How close I came to just vanishing off the face of the earth. My name would have been in Vernon's ledger right alongside theirs, probably listed under my fake name since that's what I was using at the time. Nobody would have reported me missing. Nobody would have come looking. I would have been just another drifter who moved on to the next town and never called home. I still don't know what made me stand up when I did. Was it pure instinct? Dumb luck? Or did I see something in Vernon's eyes or body language that my subconscious recognized as predatory? I've replayed that moment in my mind 1,000 times, and I still can't pinpoint the exact reason I didn't reach for that money. But whatever it was, whatever combination of instinct and observation and luck, it saved my life. 1 second later, and I'd be dead. 1 second later, and this story wouldn't exist because I wouldn't be here to tell it. These days, I work construction in Spokane, Washington. I've got a real Social Security number now, a checking account, even a small apartment that I've been renting for 3 years. I don't drift anymore. I can't. Every time I think about just picking up and moving to the next town or the next job with no plan, I remember Crestfall Bay. I remember that chair positioned over that trapdoor. I remember that floor that felt wrong. I remember Vernon's hand on that lever and the cold calculation in his eyes. I remember how easy it is to disappear when you're alone and nobody's keeping track of where you are. I should feel grateful to be alive. I should feel lucky. And I do in a way. But mostly I feel haunted. Haunted by the knowledge that I was almost one of them. That somewhere in a parallel version of October 2001, I reached for that cash 1 second earlier, and Vernon pulled that lever, and I dropped into the darkness below. In that version, nobody ever finds my body. Nobody ever knows what happened. I'm just another drifter who walked away from Crestfall Bay and never came back. Just another name that might have been in Vernon's ledger. just another ghost. But in this version, the version where I'm still here, still breathing, still alive, I can't stop thinking about the fact that Vernon looked at me across that desk and decided I was disposable, that he'd already made peace with killing me before. I even knocked on his door. To him, I was just another transaction, another cash box to empty, another body to drop through that trapdoor, and if I hadn't stood up exactly when I did, he would have pulled that lever without hesitation. He would have watched me fall. He would have reset that trapdoor mechanism, wiped down the chair, put my money in his pocket, and gone home to sleep just fine. He'd done it 37 times before. I would have been routine. I guess what really gets me, what really keeps me up at night, is how close evil can be without you ever realizing it. Vernon Keller wasn't some obvious monster lurking in the shadows. He was a union rep, a guy people trusted, a guy who shook your hand and processed your paperwork and promised to keep your money safe. He smiled when you walked into his office. He offered you a drink. He made small talk about the weather. And beneath his desk was a lever that opened a trapdoor to hell. For 8 years, he sat in that office and killed people, and nobody suspected a thing, because his victims were invisible, transient workers, drifters, people society had already given up on. I'll never go back to Crestfall Bay. I'll never work on a fishing boat again, and I'll never sit in a chair without checking the floor beneath it first. Some things change you permanently. Some experiences carve themselves so deep into your brain that you carry them forever. That night in Vernon Keller's office carved a canyon through my psyche that will never heal. I still have nightmares about it. In the dreams, I don't stand up in time. I reach for the money and the floor drops open beneath me and I'm falling through darkness into freezing black water. And above me, I can see Vernon's face looking down through the trapdoor, expressionless and cold. In some versions of the dream, I'm not alone in the water. There are others down there. 37 others. All of us floating in the dark, forgotten and silent. I wake up from those dreams in a cold, sweat, heart hammering, checking the floor beneath my bed to make sure it's solid. It always is. But the feeling stays with me. The knowledge that I was almost swallowed by the same darkness that took those 37 men. That's what happened in Crestfall Bay. That's the night I almost became a ghost. I think about that office and that chair and that lever every single day. I think about the 37 men who didn't walk out. And I think about how easy it is to disappear. How simple it is to become just another name nobody remembers. Just another person who walked away and never came back. But I did come back. I survived. And now I carry their memory with me. The 37 ghosts of Crestfall Bay. Because somebody needs to remember them. Somebody needs to say that they mattered. That they were real. That what happened to them was evil. So I remember. And every day I wake up grateful that I'm not number 38. Story 2. I still think about the winter of 1998. Not a day goes by when I don't replay certain moments in my head, wondering if I could have moved faster, seen the pattern sooner, saved even one of them. I was a detective with the Orchard Valley Police Department back then, a small town in Washington, about 40 miles east of Seattle, tucked into the Cascade foothills. Population maybe 8,000. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where a stolen bicycle makes the front page of the weekly paper, where the biggest crime we usually dealt with was drunk drivers or domestic disputes. That changed in September 1997. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let me back up. My name is Gary Donaldson, and I'd been with Orchid Valley PD for 16 years when this all started. I came from nothing. My old man worked construction. My mom cleaned houses. So when I made detective at 35, it felt like I'd climbed Everest. Small-town cop work suited me. I knew the rhythms, understood the people, felt like I was actually making a difference, instead of being another cog in some massive city police machine. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that fall. September 19th, 1997. Friday morning. I remember because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd promised to leave work early to help set up for her party. I was at my desk, drinking terrible coffee and finishing paperwork, when the call came in. A body had been found behind the Evergreen Inn, one of those upscale bed and breakfasts that catered to Seattle tourists looking for a quiet mountain getaway. The inn's manager, a guy named Stuart Crane, had found her while taking out the trash around 7 in the morning. He was barely coherent on the phone, kept saying, "There's a woman," over and over, like his brain couldn't process anything beyond those 3 words. I got there in maybe 6 minutes. The inn sat on the edge of town where the forest starts to take over, surrounded by Douglas firs and western red cedars. Beautiful property normally. That morning it felt like something out of a nightmare. She was behind the dumpster enclosure, just like Stuart had said. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, dark hair. She was naked, positioned on her back with her arms crossed over her chest like she was laid out in a coffin. Her legs were straight, feet together. Someone had placed a white orchid in her right hand. You know, the flowers Orchid Valley's named for. And here's the detail that made my stomach drop. Her left eye was covered with a wine cork. One of those fancy corks with the Evergreen Inn's logo burned into it. I'd been a cop for 16 years. I'd seen car accidents that turned my stomach. Seen what domestic violence looks like up close. Seen bodies after hunting accidents and suicides. But this was different. This wasn't violence in the heat of passion. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken time with her, arranged her, turned her into some kind of grotesque art piece. The medical examiner, Linda Parsons, arrived about 20 minutes later. Linda was good at her job, clinical, precise, didn't let emotion cloud her observations, but even she looked shaken when she finished her preliminary examination. Manual strangulation. Time of death, probably between midnight and 3 in the morning. And then, Linda pulled me aside, spoke quietly so the uniforms couldn't hear. The body had been sexually assaulted, post-mortem, after death. The positioning had happened hours after she'd been killed, based on lividity patterns that didn't match how we'd found her. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't a murder. This was something else entirely. We identified her by that afternoon. Clarissa Howe, 29, pharmaceutical sales rep from Portland. She'd been staying at the Evergreen Inn for 3 nights, in town for client meetings, at the regional hospital. Divorced, no kids. Her family lived in Oregon. The last time anyone had seen her alive was the previous evening at the Timber Room, Orchid Valley's only upscale bar and restaurant. The Timber Room catered to the same crowd as the Evergreen Inn. Wealthy tourists, visiting business people, locals with money. It had this exclusive feel to it, even though technically anyone could walk in. Dark wood paneling, leather booths, a wine list that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. We pulled their security footage. There she was, Clarissa, sitting at the bar around 9 p.m., wearing a blue dress, smiling at the bartender. She looked relaxed, happy even. And then, at 9:43 p.m., a man approached her. Tall, maybe 6'1" or 6'2", athletic build, well-dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt. brown hair, clean-shaven. They talked for over an hour. The footage showed them laughing, him buying her drinks, his hand occasionally touching her arm or shoulder in that casual way that could be friendly or could be something more. At 11:07 p.m., they left together. His hand was on the small of her back as they walked out. That was the last time security cameras captured Clarissa Howe alive. We canvassed the timber room, showed still frames from the footage to everyone who'd been working that night. The bartender, a college kid named Austin Reed, remembered them. Said the guy was a regular, came in 2 or 3 times a week. Always well-dressed, always polite, always alone until he'd spot a woman sitting by herself. Austin said the guy told people he was some kind of consultant. Medical devices or pharmaceuticals or something in that world. Friendly guy, good tipper. But Austin didn't know his name, paid cash every time. That was our first real lead. A regular at the timber room who paid cash and targeted women who were alone. It wasn't much, but it was something. The case consumed me. I couldn't let it go. My wife Angela kept telling me I needed to step back, that I was barely sleeping, that I'd missed Emma's entire birthday party because I'd stayed at the station until midnight reviewing footage over and over. She was right, but I couldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clarissa Howe's body, positioned like a doll, that orchid in her hand, that cork over her eye. Someone had done this to her. Someone who walked around Orchid Valley like a normal person, who drank at the timber room, who looked so harmless that women trusted him enough to leave bars with him. And then November 6th happened. Another body. This time at a private residence on Laurel Heights Drive, one of those streets where houses start at $500,000 and go up from there. The victim was Joanna Caldwell, 33, an attorney who'd just relocated to Orchid Valley from California to open a satellite office for her firm. She'd bought a renovated craftsman bungalow about 2 months earlier, lived alone. Her cleaning service found her. The scene was worse than Clarissa's. Joanna was on her bed, positioned, on her side with her legs crossed at the ankles, bent at the knees like she was lounging. She was naked. A silk scarf, her own from her closet, was tied in a perfect bow around her neck. Her right hand was positioned like she was holding a wine glass, except there was no glass. Just her hand frozen in that gesture. And here's what made me want to vomit. The killer had inserted objects into her body post-mortem. A fireplace poker from her own living room. Multiple implements. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was rage. Linda Parsons did the autopsy. Ligature, strangulation with the scarf. Post-mortem sexual assault with objects. Post-mortem positioning. Time of death, approximately midnight. Joanna had last been seen at the timber room on November 5th, around 10 p.m. Security footage showed the same man from Clarissa's footage approaching her at 10:31 p.m. They talked for about 45 minutes. At 11:19 p.m., they left together. She let him into her house. Somehow this man had convinced Joanna Caldwell to bring him home. And then he'd strangled her in her own bedroom and spent hours violating her corpse. That's when I knew we were dealing with a serial killer. Not someone who'd snapped twice. Someone who had a pattern, a method, a pathology that wasn't going to stop. I put together a task force. We weren't a big department, maybe 20 officers total, but I pulled in everyone I could. My partner, Hugh Carmichael, who'd been working property crimes. Sergeant Bonnie Fletcher, from patrol. The chief brought in an FBI consultant, a woman named Adrienne Cross, who specialized in sexual homicides and psychopathic offenders. Adrienne looked at the crime scene photos for maybe 10 minutes before she turned to me and said, "He's going to kill again, soon. He's escalating." She walked me through the psychology. This was a man who felt invisible, inadequate, powerless in his real life. He targeted successful, attractive, independent women because they represented everything he wanted but couldn't have. The post-mortem assault wasn't about sex. It was about finally having absolute control over women who would have rejected him while alive. The staging was his art, his way of proving he was special, that he could create something. The intervals will get shorter, Adrian said. He's chasing the high. The euphoria he feels after each kill fades faster each time, so he needs to do it again to feel that power. And the staging will get more elaborate because he's building toward some perfect vision in his head. She was right. February 21st, 1998. Barely 3 months after Joanna. A jogger found the third victim in Riverside Park at dawn. Bryn Archer, 26, graphic designer, recently moved to Orchid Valley from Spokane. She'd been in town less than a month. This scene was different, more public, more theatrical. Bryn was fully clothed, jeans, sweater, jacket, boots, but Linda confirmed the clothing had been removed and then put back on post-mortem. She was seated upright against a massive cedar tree, legs extended straight, hands folded in her lap. Someone had placed a children's book open on her lap. Goodnight Moon, if you can believe that. Her eyes were open, held that way with medical tape. Most disturbing, evidence of a sex toy forced into her throat post-mortem, then removed and placed beside her like an offering. The FBI profiler had predicted escalation. This was it. The killer had moved from private locations to a public park. He wanted his work seen, wanted recognition. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about proving something, showing off. We reviewed the timber room footage again. There he was. February 20th, 9:58 p.m. Same man, we were sure now it was the same guy, approaching Bryn at the bar. She'd been there with co-workers for a happy hour, but they'd left around 9:30. She'd stayed for one more drink. That's when he'd made his move. They talked for 93 minutes. At 11:34 p.m., they left together. I was losing my mind. 3 women dead. 3 elaborate crime scenes. We had footage of the suspect. We knew his hunting ground. We had a behavioral profile. But we didn't have a name. We didn't have an address. He paid cash everywhere. Never used credit cards at the timber room. But then Hugh found something. He'd been going through the timber room's membership records. Yeah, they had a members-only section in the back for regulars willing to pay an annual fee, and he found a name that matched the timeline. Randall Shepard. Joined the membership program in June 1996, about 14 months before Clarissa's murder. Listed occupation, medical device sales consultant. Except when we ran his financials, nothing matched. Randall Shepard's credit card showed a warehouse job salary, dead up to his eyeballs, spending way beyond his means. He lived in a studio apartment in the less affluent part of town, but spent like he was pulling 6 figures. The medical device consultant story was complete fiction. He was a warehouse inventory manager making $38,000 a year while pretending to be successful, to impress women at the timber room. We pulled his employment records. He worked at Cascades, medical supply, a warehouse that distributed hospital equipment. We got warrants for his apartment, his vehicle, his work locker. The apartment was meticulous, obsessively clean. But in a locked box under his bed, we found 44 photographs of women, candid shots taken without their knowledge, notes scrawled on the backs. Too loud, perfect, alone, stuck up, maybe. Newspaper clippings about all 3 murders, and a journal. I read that journal, sitting in his apartment wearing latex gloves, my hands shaking. It was a manifesto of narcissism and rage. Entries about how women at the timber room only noticed him when he lied about his job. Entries describing Clarissa, Joanna, and Bryn in detail. How they'd finally been honest when they were dead. How he'd freed them from their performances. How arranging their bodies was his art, his masterpiece, proof that he was special. The last entry, dated February 22nd, the day after Bryn's murder, said, 3 perfect compositions. The police are idiots. I'm already planning number 4. His BMW had fiber evidence from all 3 victims. Soil from Riverside Park. Trace DNA. A tire iron with microscopic blood spatter matching Joanna Caldwell. At his work locker, we found surgical gloves stolen from warehouse inventory, plastic sheeting, cleaning supplies, and a Polaroid camera with developed photos of all 3 victims, post-mortem, staged, violated. Trophies. We arrested Randall Shepard on March 1st, 1998, at his apartment. He was getting ready for work, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a week, cologne that smelled expensive. When I put the handcuffs on him, he smiled. During interrogation, he couldn't help himself. His lawyer kept telling him to shut up. But Randall wanted to talk, needed to talk. He described the murders like he was explaining artwork at a gallery. Called Clarissa, Joanna, and Bryn his canvases. Said he'd curated them, not staged them. Claimed he'd freed them from their fake performances and their superior attitudes. When I asked him if he felt any remorse, he leaned forward and said, "Why would I? For the first time in my pathetic life, I had power. I was God. They couldn't ignore me anymore." He confessed to all 3 murders on tape. Described details only the killer would know. Showed 0 empathy, 0 guilt. Just pride. The trial took 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for barely 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. 3 first-degree murders, sexual assault on a corpse, abuse of corpses, kidnapping, breaking and entering. The judge gave him 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Before they took him away, Randall looked at the victims' families in the courtroom and smiled. Actually smiled. That was 28 years ago. Randall Shepard is still in prison. I'm retired now, living in Arizona with Angela. Emma's grown up, has kids of her own. Hugh Carmichael passed away 6 years ago, heart attack. Linda Parsons retired around the same time I did, but I still think about those 3 women. Clarissa Howe, Joanna Caldwell, Bryn Archer. They were just trying to live their lives, have a drink after work, meet new people. They didn't do anything wrong. They just crossed paths with someone who saw women not as human beings, but as objects for his ego. The thing that haunts me most is the journal. In those 44 photographs we found in Randall's apartment, we only ever identified 3 victims. That means 41 other women were on his radar. Women he'd photographed without their knowledge, evaluated, considered. We showed those photos on the news, released them to the media. We identified 38 of them eventually. Just women who'd had brief conversations with him at the timber room, completely unaware he'd been stalking them. 3 women were never identified. Their photos are still in the case file. Sometimes I wonder if they know how close they came. And then there's the bigger question. Were there others before Clarissa? Randall was 32 when we arrested him. The journal only started in July 1997, just 2 months before Clarissa's murder. But these pathologies don't appear overnight. He'd been fantasizing about this for years, maybe decades. Did he kill in other cities? Other states? We searched everything within 100 miles of Orchid Valley. We found nothing. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. I think about that sometimes late at night when I can't sleep. How many women might have crossed paths with Randall Shepard over the years? How many times did his mask almost slip before he finally acted on his fantasies in Orchid Valley? The families of the victims have moved on as best they can. Clarissa's mother started a scholarship fund for women in STEM fields. Joanna's brother established a legal aid fund for domestic violence survivors. Bryn's family compiled her design work into a book, with proceeds going to art programs for kids. They turned their grief into something beautiful, something that helps people. Randall tried to erase 3 women and replace them with his sick version of art. He failed. They're remembered for who they actually were: talented, kind, full of potential. He's remembered as the pathetic narcissist who killed them because he couldn't handle that women like them would never love someone like him. I drove through Orchid Valley last year, first time in a decade. The timber room is gone, closed in 2001, torn down 2 years later. The Evergreen Inn is still there, but under new ownership and a new name. Riverside Park looks the same. That massive cedar tree still standing. It's a quiet town. Beautiful, really. Tucked into those mountains with orchids growing wild every spring. Most people who live there now don't even remember the murders. They weren't born yet, or they moved there afterward, drawn by the scenery and the peaceful small-town life. That's probably for the best. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I'm back in that interrogation room with Randall Shepard. I'm watching him lean forward with that proud smile on his face, describing 3 women he murdered, like they were objects he'd collected. And I think about how he's spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement now, isolated and powerless, his entire identity stripped away. He wanted to be remembered as an artist. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when narcissism meets psychopathy. Justice isn't always perfect, but that's all we have. Story 3. I still think about her sometimes, especially on cold February nights when the rain turns to sleet and the whole world feels empty. Her name was Alina Petrov, and she was 23 years old when I met her. She wanted to be a software developer. She wanted to bring her younger sister to America. She wanted to be free. I was her ESL tutor at Pinecrest Community Center back in early 2002. Pinecrest is one of those blink-and-you-miss-it Oregon towns about 90 miles outside Portland. Population maybe 4,000 if you count the surrounding farms. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and newcomers stand out like a sore thumb. The community center was this old converted Grange hall with creaky floors and radiators that clanged so loudly you had to stop mid-sentence until they quieted down. But it was warm, and it was free, and it was the only place in town that offered English classes to immigrants. Alina definitely stood out. She was brilliant, hardworking, and terrified. This all happened in the winter and spring of 2003. I was 26 at the time, working part-time at the community center, teaching English to immigrants while finishing my education degree at Portland State. The pay was terrible, something like $12 an hour, but I loved it. Most of my students were farm workers or elderly folks trying to connect with their grandkids. We'd practice conversations about grocery shopping and weather and doctor appointments. Simple, everyday things that could be incredibly complicated when you didn't speak the language. Then Alina showed up in September 2002. She came to every Tuesday and Thursday evening class without fail, always 15 minutes early, always prepared with her homework completed in neat handwriting. She'd stay after for an extra hour practicing conversation with me. Her English was already pretty good when she arrived. She'd studied it in Kazakhstan, but she wanted to be perfect. She told me once that language was power, and she needed all the power she could get. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was just being ambitious. Now I know she meant survival. Her husband would wait outside in his car, every single class. I noticed him the second week. This massive guy, I'm talking easily over 300 pounds, sitting in a black Ford Explorer with the engine running. He never came inside, never walked her to the door, just sat there watching the community center entrance until she came out. The first time I saw him, I felt this weird chill run down my spine. Something about the way he stared at the building. It wasn't concern or affection. It was surveillance, like he was monitoring an asset, making sure his investment didn't wander off. I tried not to judge. Maybe he was protective. Maybe he didn't speak English and felt awkward. Maybe he was just shy. People, all kinds of reasons for their behavior, and I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but Alina never talked about him. In a class where everyone shared stories about their families and their spouses, Gloria bragging about her husband's tamales, Jun showing off photos of his wife's pottery, elderly Mrs. Lee telling us about her grandson's baseball games, Alina never mentioned the man in the parking lot. When other students asked about her husband, she'd give one-word answers and change the subject. She'd say he worked in computers, that he was from Ohio, that they'd met through an agency. Then she'd immediately ask someone else about their week. About 3 months into the class, I started noticing other things. Alina had bruises. They were always in places her long sleeves and high collars, mostly covered, but sometimes I'd catch glimpses. A purple mark on her wrist when she reached for a book. A fading yellow bruise on her collarbone when her scarf slipped. Once I saw what looked like a cigarette burn on the inside of her forearm. She caught me staring and pulled her sleeve down quickly. Her face went red. Not embarrassed red. Scared red. I asked her if she was okay. We were alone after class in mid-December. Everyone else had left. The radiators were hissing and it had started snowing outside, big fat flakes that stuck to the windows. She looked at me with these huge brown eyes that were equal parts exhausted and desperate. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then glanced toward the window. The Explorer was already there. She grabbed her bag and practically ran out the door. I watched her through the window as she climbed into the passenger seat. He said something to her. Even from inside, I could see her body language change. She got smaller somehow, like she was trying to disappear. I felt sick to my stomach. I'd been in an abusive relationship myself a few years prior, and I recognized the signs, the isolation, the constant monitoring, the fear, the way someone can make you feel like you're always one wrong move away from disaster. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. She was an immigrant on a spousal visa. I knew from other students how precarious that situation could be. If she left her husband, she could be deported. She'd lose everything. And who knows what would happen to her back in Kazakhstan. Would her family blame her for failing? Would she be able to find work? Would she ever get another chance at the life she dreamed of? The holidays came and went. We had a 2-week break from classes. I spent Christmas with my parents in Eugene and couldn't stop thinking about Alina, wondering if she was safe, wondering if I should have said more, done more. But what could I do? I was just her English tutor. I had no authority, no power. I could barely pay my own rent. The next class, in January 2003, I made a decision. After everyone left, I handed Alina a folder. Inside were pamphlets for domestic violence resources and the number for a women's shelter in Portland that specialized in helping immigrant women. I'd called them myself the week before to make sure they could help someone on a spousal visa. They told me, yes, absolutely, they had advocates who understood immigration law and could help arrange safe transitions. I told Alina these were just in case she ever needed them. I told her she had options. I told her she deserved to be safe. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was shaking. I was terrified she'd reject the help. Or worse, that her husband would find out I'd given her these resources and something bad would happen. She took the folder and held it against her chest like it was something precious. Then she asked me a question I'll never forget. She said if someone needed to leave somewhere but they were being watched all the time, where would they go to plan it? Her voice was so quiet I barely heard her. I told her the library had private computer stations where no one could see your screen. I told her the shelter had advocates who could help arrange safe transportation and temporary housing. I told her there were people who specialized in exactly this situation. She nodded slowly, taking it all in, processing every word like her life depended on it. Because it did. Then she smiled at me. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. Like she wanted to believe escape was possible, but didn't quite dare to hope. That was January 23rd. The next class was January 28th. Alina seemed different. She was distracted, kept checking her phone nervously. She'd glance at it under the table during lessons and type something quickly, then put it away. During the break, she texted me. I'd given her my number weeks earlier in case she needed anything related to class. The text said, "If something happens to me, it was him. Please remember that." I stared at that message. My hands started shaking. I texted back immediately, asking if she was in danger right now. Should I call someone? Did she need me to come get her? Where was she? The 3 dots appeared, showing she was typing then. Disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared. 10 minutes passed. I was about to call 911 when her response came through. Not yet, but soon, I think. I'm going to try to leave. I found help. The shelter is sending someone. I'm scared, but I have to do this. I texted back asking when. Asking if I could help. Asking if she was sure she'd be safe. She didn't respond again. The second half of class was torture. I kept glancing at her, trying to catch her eye, but she stared at her textbook. We were practicing past tense verbs. She conjugated every single one perfectly. Always did. After class, I tried to talk to her, but he was already there in the parking lot. She practically sprinted to the car. I watched her get in, and I saw him say something to her. She flinched, pulled back against the passenger door like she wanted to melt into it. They drove away. That was the last time I saw her. She didn't come to class on February 4th. I told myself maybe she'd gotten sick. Maybe she'd made it to the shelter and was starting her new life. Maybe everything had worked out. But my stomach felt like it was filled with lead. February 6th came. No Alina. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. February 11th. Still nothing. By February 13th, I was panicking. I drove to the address she'd listed on her registration form. It was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of industrial building that had been turned into cheap apartments. Probably not up to code. Probably cold and depressing. I knocked on the door for 5 minutes. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I walked around the building, peering in the windows, but the blinds were all drawn. The Explorer wasn't in the parking lot. The whole place felt abandoned. I called the police. They told me to file a missing person report, which I did immediately. I brought all my documentation, her attendance records, the text messages, screenshots of everything. I told them about the bruises, about the husband, who watched her constantly, about her fear, about the text message saying, "If something happens to me, it was him." The officer taking my report was this young guy who looked maybe 23. He wrote everything down, but I could tell he didn't think it was urgent. He probably figured she'd gone back to her home country or left her husband voluntarily. Another domestic situation that would sort itself out. They said they'd look into it. 2 days later, on February 15th, a detective named Lauren Dixon called me. She wanted to meet. We sat in a coffee shop in downtown Pinecrest, and I told her everything. Every single detail I could remember. Detective Dixon was in her early 40s with sharp eyes and this intensity that made me feel like she actually gave a damn. She took notes in this little leather notebook filling page after page. She'd seen Alina's immigration file. She'd seen the bruises in the visa photos from when Alina first arrived in the country back in February 2002. The photos showed a beautiful young woman with hopeful eyes and a barely concealed bruise on her cheek and jawline. The bruises were already there when she arrived. He'd been abusing her from day one. Dixon knew something was wrong. Dixon told me they'd interviewed the husband. His name was Carl Hammond, 45 years old, former college football player, worked in IT security remotely from home. He claimed Alina had left him. Said she'd met some Russian businessman online and flew back to Moscow for a better deal. He'd shown them emails and searches and even a note supposedly from Alina saying she was leaving. Something like, "I'm sorry this isn't the life I wanted." But Dixon didn't buy it. She said Carl was too calm, too prepared, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced his story. Most people whose spouse suddenly disappears show some kind of emotion. Anger, sadness, confusion. Carl showed nothing. Just mild annoyance like she'd been an inconvenience. Over the next 3 weeks, Dixon kept me updated. They'd obtained warrants for Carl's computer and phone. The digital forensics team tore through everything. The emails to the Russian businessman were fake, sent from Carl's IP address using proxy servers to make them look like they came from Moscow. He'd researched how to fake email headers. He'd Googled Oregon forest decomposition rates and untraceable burial locations and quicklime purchase. His credit card showed purchases of quicklime, plastic sheeting, and industrial gloves all bought in the days after Alina's disappearance. He'd also Googled how long for body to decompose in cold weather and best soil types for burial. Dixon also discovered Carl had a storage unit. Inside were belongings from 2 other women, previous mail-order brides who'd escaped. Clothes, photos, personal items, like trophies. Both women confirmed Carl had abused and controlled them. Both had been told their visas were conditional on wifely compliance. Both had been monitored, constantly. Both had been too terrified to report him. They'd just run. One woman named Amy had escaped to a domestic violence shelter in Seattle in 1997. Another woman named Natalia had fled to a Ukrainian community in Chicago in 2000. Both were still scared of him years later, but they still needed to find Alina. There was a tenant living in the warehouse, some guy named Owen Ridley, who rented the upstairs loft. Dixon interviewed him 6 times over 3 weeks. She said he was clearly terrified of Carl. He had a drug problem, and Carl had been supplying him with prescription pills. He owed $4,000 in back rent. He was trapped just like Alina had been. Dixon said she could see Owen deteriorating with every interview. His hands shook. He had track marks on his arms. He wouldn't make eye contact. She knew he knew something, but breaking him took time. On the 6th interview, Dixon changed tactics. She showed Owen photos of Alina from my class, smiling, practicing English. She told Owen that Alina was 23 years old, that she wanted to be a computer programmer, that she wanted to bring her little sister to America. She told him that Alina had asked me where someone would go if they needed to escape. Owen started crying. Dixon said it was like watching a dam break. He confessed everything. On March 8th, Dixon called me. Her voice was different, heavier. She said Owen had confessed to being an accomplice. He'd led them to a location in the Cascade foothills about 40 miles east of Pinecrest. They'd found Alina's body buried 7 feet deep, wrapped in plastic sheeting. Cadaver dogs had alerted to the location, and the forensic team had excavated carefully. She'd been there for 2 weeks. I remember hanging up the phone. I remember sliding down the wall in my kitchen until I was sitting on the floor. I remember screaming. I'd known she was probably dead, but having it confirmed shattered something inside me. This brilliant young woman who'd done everything right, who'd studied hard, who'd been brave enough to try to escape, who'd asked for help, and it hadn't been enough. The details came out during the trial. Carl had caught Alina trying to escape on February 25th. She'd packed a bag. She'd contacted the shelter. She had her passport in her hand. She was waiting for the shelter's advocate to arrive when Carl came home early. He'd installed tracking software on her phone and had been monitoring her messages. He knew exactly what she was planning. Carl called Owen downstairs. He told Owen to hold her wrists. Owen was high and owed Carl money and was too scared to refuse. Then Carl sat on her chest, all 340 pounds of him, and strangled her with his necktie, the same tie he'd worn to their courthouse wedding. The medical examiner said she'd have been unable to breathe from the chest compression alone. The strangulation just finished it faster. It took 4 minutes for her to die. Owen counted. He said he didn't know why he counted. Maybe because he needed to know exactly how much of a monster he was. Owen testified that Carl stood up afterward and said, "She signed a contract. She broke it. This is breach of terms." Like he was talking about a cell phone plan. Like Alina was a service that had failed to meet expectations. Then they wrapped her body in plastic sheeting and drove to the burial site Carl had already selected. They buried her that night in a location Carl had researched extensively. Soil composition, decomposition rates, wildlife patterns, distance from hiking trails. He'd planned it all out. 3 days after the murder, Carl had written to the International Marriage Agency asking about refund policies and replacement options. He'd already started browsing new catalogs, new women, new victims. He wrote that his previous arrangement hadn't worked out and he wanted someone more compliant this time. Preferably from rural Philippines or Vietnam, because he'd found women from former Soviet countries had unrealistic expectations about independence. The trial was in April 2004. I testified about the bruises, the fear, the text message. Alina's mother flew in from Kazakhstan. She was a small woman who looked like she'd aged 20 years in the past year. During her victim impact statement, she spoke through a translator. She said, "My daughter was brilliant. She was brave. She wanted to make something of herself in a world that told her she couldn't. She thought America was freedom. Instead, she found a cage. Carl Hammond didn't just kill my daughter. He killed our family's hope." I was sitting in the gallery, and I watched Carl's face during the testimony. Nothing, no emotion, no remorse, no recognition that he'd destroyed an entire family. He just sat there taking notes on a legal pad like this was a business meeting. Carl was sentenced to 35 years without parole. Owen got 12 years for being an accomplice. Detective Dixon told me after the sentencing that she'd never seen anyone as cold as Carl. Even after conviction, he showed no remorse. He genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. He'd purchased a product that malfunctioned and disposed of it. In his mind, Alina had broken a contract, and there were consequences for that. Here's the part that keeps me up at night, though. About 3 months after the trial, Detective Dixon called me one last time. She told me there was something I needed to know. After Carl's arrest, they'd found correspondence on his computer with 17 other men who'd also used international marriage agencies, men who'd also purchased mail-order brides. They were sharing tips on how to control women, how to isolate them, how to monitor their communications, how to break them down psychologically. It was like a handbook for abuse. Dixon said they'd opened investigations into 8 of those men. 3 had wives who'd mysteriously disappeared. 2 had wives who'd returned to their home countries with no exit records at any airport or border crossing. 1 had a wife who died in a tragic accident that looked increasingly suspicious under closer examination. Dixon said the FBI was now involved. This was bigger than just Carl Hammond. This was a network. I asked Dixon how many women she thought were out there, trapped in situations like Alina's, invisible because they had no family in America, no community, no one who'd even notice if they vanished. She said she didn't know. Hundreds, maybe. Thousands. These women arrive in America with dreams and hope, and they disappear into these isolated situations. Their families back home get letters saying everything is fine, or phone calls where the husband hovers in the background, and then one day the communication stops, and the family doesn't know who to call or how to find them. They don't know the address. They don't know the local police. They don't speak English. Their daughter or sister or niece just vanishes, and there's nothing they can do about it. I think about that sometimes. How many Alinas are out there right now? How many brilliant young women who just wanted a chance at education and freedom are being monitored, controlled, and erased by men who see them as property? I still teach ESL at the community center. I'm more vigilant now. I look for the signs, the bruises, the fear, the husband who watches from the parking lot. I hand out those resource folders to every immigrant woman in my class, not just the ones I suspect are being abused. Everyone. I tell them they have options. I tell them they deserve safety. I make sure they know they can call me anytime. I've helped 3 women escape abusive situations since Alina died. 3 women who are now safe and free and building the lives they deserve. But I still see Alina's face, still hear her voice asking me where someone would go if they needed to escape, still feel the weight of that text message. If something happens to me, it was him. I wish I'd done more. Wish I'd called the police earlier. Wish I'd convinced her to leave that night in January instead of just handing her a folder. Wish I'd physically stopped her from getting in that car on January 28th. Wish I'd offered to let her stay with me. Wish I'd driven her to the shelter myself. Wish I'd stood in that parking lot and refused to let him take her. But I was too slow, too careful, too afraid of overstepping, too worried about boundaries and what-ifs and making things worse. And Alina paid the price. Carl Hammond is currently serving his sentence at Oregon State Penitentiary. He's filed 7 appeals, all denied. He maintains his innocence. Prison psychological evaluations say he demonstrates persistent narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. He shows no capacity for empathy. He continues to view Alina as property that malfunctioned. He poses an extreme risk to women if ever released. He'll be eligible for parole in 2038 when he's 78 years old. Alina Petrov was 23 years old. She spoke 3 languages. She was the best student I ever taught. She wanted to be a software developer. She wanted to bring her sister to America. She wanted freedom. Carl Hammond wanted a slave. The only justice is that he'll spend the rest of his life in a cage. The same cage he built for her. But some nights, when the rain turns to sleet, I think about all the other women. The ones still trapped, still monitored, still waiting for someone to notice. I think about how easy it is to not see what's right in front of you. How easy it is to tell yourself it's not your business, or maybe you're wrong, or maybe you'll make things worse. I hope they get out. I hope someone sees the signs. I hope someone is braver than I was. I hope someone acts faster. Because Alina didn't get out. And that's something I'll carry forever. Sometimes my current students ask me why I'm so intense about the domestic violence resources, why I make sure everyone has the shelter number, why I notice when someone seems scared or isolated. I don't usually tell them about Alina, but I want them to know that I see them, that they matter, that they deserve safety and freedom and the chance to build the life they dreamed of. Because that's all Alina wanted. And she should have gotten it. She should still be here. She should have finished her degree. She should have brought her sister to America. She should have become an amazing software developer. She should have lived. Instead, there's a grave in Kazakhstan and a hollow space in the world where a brilliant young woman should have been. And all because a man decided he owned her. That's the story. That's what happened in Pinecrest, Oregon in 2003. And it's happening right now in small towns all across America. Women arriving with hope and ending up in cages. Some escape, some don't. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in Alina's story, please reach out for help. You deserve better. You deserve safety. You deserve freedom. There are people who will help you. There are shelters. There are advocates. There are ways out. And if you're listening to this and you recognize someone else in Alina's story, please say something. Call someone. Don't wait. Don't be afraid of overstepping. Don't worry about being wrong, because being wrong is so much better than being too late. I was too late for Alina. Don't be too late for someone else